Okay, so we're back in Luke. We're back in Luke today. We're going to be in Luke 9. So as you may recall, or if you haven't been here, you wouldn't be able to recall that. But so a little bit of where we've been in Luke. This is our 28th. This is our 28th week in Luke, and we're in chapter 9. And we took a break for Advent, so now we're back. Breaks are nice, but the problem with breaks is that sometimes you need to remember where you left off. So when we left off in Luke in November, I think I said that we had reached the end of a section of Luke that ended in chapter 9, and I was wrong. We have one more day today looking at the first major section of Luke, and then we will move on to this middle section of Luke starting next week. So anyway, Luke the author, for the first 9 chapters here, he's been working pretty hard to tell us a few things, to show us a few things. I've got 6 of them. There's probably more. But first, he's been working very hard to show us that Jesus was a real person who lived in a particular time. That this is not some myth. Well, it is a myth, but it's a true myth. It is actually rooted in an actual person who lived in a particular time. And so he has been taking pains to point out what was going on around. Second, he has been taking pains to show that the history that is being recounted is that of God's actions. So this is not stuff that happened to Jesus, or this is not stuff that happened to Mary. This is stuff that God is doing. These are his actions that he's recounting. Third, he's been taking pains to show that Jesus was in the line of King David, and that his life fulfilled the promises given to Israel. Fourth, he's been showing that Jesus is in the line of the true prophets of God. His ministry was marked by announcing the gospel of God and by caring for the physical needs of listeners with miraculous works. Fifth, Jesus was in the line of God. He was God's son. And then the last one that I've got for today is that Jesus was here for a purpose and was preparing 12 men to follow him in this ministry that after he left. So that's specific to chapter 9. So chapter 9 has been a record of Jesus sending out those 12, calling them apostles, and that they sent them out to do the same ministry that he's been doing, to announce the gospel of God and to heal and to cast out demons. And they did it, and they were successful, and they came back enthusiastic about it. Then we have, after that, the feeding of the crowd of thousands. And then we have a clear announcement in Luke 9:22 that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised up on the 3rd day. So this is clarion call in the middle of chapter 9. And then we have a visibly different Jesus on a mountain talking to Moses and Elijah. And the last thing that we heard before our text for today is the voice from the cloud, God, saying in Luke 9:35, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." That's where we've been. So that's a quick overview of where we've been. So now let's read our text for today. So we are in Luke 9, verses 37 to 50. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. And a man from the crowd shouted, saying, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only boy. And a spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams, and it throws him into a convulsion with foaming at the mouth, and only with difficulty does it leave him, mauling him as it leaves. I begged your disciples to cast it out, and they could not." And Jesus answered and said, "You unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? bring your son here." While he was still approaching, the demon slammed him to the ground and threw him into a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. But while everyone was marveling at all that he was doing, he said to his disciples, "Let these words sink into your ears, for the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." But they did not understand this statement, and it was concealed from them, so that they could not perceive it, and they were afraid to ask him about this statement. An argument started among them as to which of them might be the greatest. But Jesus, knowing that what they were thinking in their heart, took a child and stood him by his side. And he said to them, "Whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. For the one who is least among all of you is the one who is great." John answered and said, "Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he does not follow along with us." But Jesus said to him, "Do not hinder him, for he who is not against you is for you." That's our text for today. So here we go. So the first thing that happens in Luke 37 is that Luke tells us, as you would in a story, he tells us when and where the next events took place and who was there, right? So on the next day, so Jesus had been up on the mountain with Peter, James, and John, I think, and he has been transformed into looking differently. He speaks with Moses and Elijah, and then God speaks out of the cloud. That happened in the night, and the next day, they come down. They came down from the mountain. They have come back down to where they had left the crowd to go up and pray, and a large crowd met him. The large crowd was still there, waiting for him. So, what happens? Well, immediately we have a man, a father, from the crowd shouting, begging for Jesus to heal his son, his only boy, he says. This is the third only child brought by a parent to Jesus to be saved in what we've read of Luke so far. The third time, only child. It's very, very parallel. The description that Luke relates is of a boy with epilepsy, all right? And the description of a grand mal seizure. That this is something many of us may have witnessed a seizure like this, and it can be a terrifying thing. Because there's nothing that we as a bystander can do except maybe keep things away from them so they don't hurt themselves more, right? There's just really nothing we can do. That's it, is just wait for it to end, for most of us. In our text, this is attributed to a spirit, specifically to a demon, which was the best explanation that could be given at the time for the health issues that had no other reason, right? It was a demon. We now have other explanations, but that doesn't really change the fact that a person experiencing this cannot save themselves. They can't do anything about this. There is something happening to them that they can't do anything about. I mean, just to take my simple example from before. I was not feeling good. We think it's high blood pressure. So I changed my diet and things are improving. There are things that I can do. I can't actually cure myself, but there are things that I can do. But what we have here with this boy is not something they can do anything about. There's nothing they can do. Okay, they can't save themselves. This parent can't save the child. So what else has happened? Here we also see that the man had come to Jesus' disciples, and he had begged them to exorcise his son. And the disciples were unable to do anything. They were unable to help. They were unable to save them. In Matthew and Mark, there's a lot more conversation about why this was true. There's actually a whole conversation about it. But Luke leaves all that out. And an important question we always need to have when we see differences like this is, how does this change? How does the way that Luke told this story help us see what he is trying to tell us, right? So the disciples were unable to help. And yet we are in the very same chapter where they had been sent out and successfully healed people, right? These same people had been the same ones who had been sent out without Jesus and had done this. What has happened? Why is there a change? What has happened to this change? I think we started seeing this in when we talked about the feeding of the 5,000, where Luke went from calling them apostles to calling them disciples. You'll see they're still called disciples here. They went from being sent out to now just being followers who are not able to do what they need to be done. Jesus has a specific answer. So here in 9:41, he says, "And Jesus answered and said, 'You unbelieving and perverted generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you?'" Unbelieving and perverted. Jesus is talking about something specific. Unbelieving, I think we can get. Unbelieving, they just didn't, for some reason, they went from, earlier in chapter 9, believing that God had given them the power, there I'm adding that in, given them the power to do this, to now that they're not in that place. For some reason, they don't think that God has given them the power to do this. So who is he talking to here? The other thing that we need to be very clear about. Jesus is not talking generally. He's speaking to the disciples. This is pointed right at the disciples. This is not anything, it is pointed to the whole group, but he is specifically speaking to the 12. And he's talking to them. And we need to remember that this happened. And Jesus has attributed this to unbelief and perversion. So what does perversion mean? All right. The modern hearer, like us, probably has Epstein come to mind, right? That's what we think about when we think about perversion. But that's not actually, it's not that specific. It does not actually have any sexual connotations. To be perverted is to be changed from the original intent. To have altered from an original course. To have turned away from a goal. That's what perverted means. You have had a goal, but you have turned away from that goal. You have changed course. You have perverted. You are in perversion. And that makes sense for what we see here, right? Because the disciples, when they were apostles, they went out doing what they were called to do, and they did it. And somehow, from the beginning of chapter 9 to here, they have turned. Something has changed. Something has changed. And the unbelief is really scary, that they could go from that to turning to being unbelieving, just in one chapter. It's a little frightening to me. I can tell you that for sure. So in the first verse of this chapter, the apostles were sent out to announce the gospel and to heal, and they did. Now they are back with Jesus and can't stay on the path that they had been on. We'll come to why in a minute. So now we're into 42 and 43. And when the boy, and Jesus just deals with it, right? When the boy comes forward, Jesus calls the boy forward. When the boy comes forward, the Spirit seizes him, and everyone is clear that this is a real, as in other places, they see the problem. Everyone sees the problem, and Jesus heals by rebuking the disease, by rebuking the spirit. That's how he is always healed in Luke. It is always about rebuking the spirit and sending the spirit out, sending the disease away. And then he gave the boy back to his parents. This is the same language used for the widow and her only boy who was dead and God raised from the dead. This is the same language used for the synagogue leader whose only daughter was on her deathbed and had died by the time they got there. This is the same language. He healed, He saved, and then he gave back to the parents. And what was the response of the people? The people were amazed at the greatness of God, right? They were not amazed by God's work. They were not amazed by Jesus, this healer. They were amazed at the greatness of God. And that also has been true all the way through Luke. Jesus never did this in a way that it wasn't clearly tied to the gospel of God. He is always doing it tied to God. And the crowd here sees it. Always in Luke, the miracles of healing are done by Jesus, cause amazement and marveling and worship of God. But Jesus doesn't wait around for that, right? Look at the text. He says, but while everyone was marveling. Jesus has something in mind here, but Jesus doesn't wait. While they were still marveling, Jesus turns to his disciples and says, let these words sink into your ears, for the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. What? What does that have to do with the greatness of God? Delivered into the hands of men? This is another reminder that Jesus is headed to a specific place. He has a specific job to do. There is a path that Jesus is on, and he is not going to be perverted from it. He is going to stay on his path. He will not turn away. The people are in the midst of worship, and Jesus reminds the disciples that he is going to be handed over to men. It is not a misunderstanding. He is not going to be handed over to men because of misunderstanding. It is not the result of the ministry not working. It is working exactly the way it's supposed to. It is not because the current ministry is unsuccessful. It is because it is the plan. It is specifically because this is the intended course. It is the one way that this is going to happen. It is the reason that Jesus was here as a human, was to be handed over to men. There has also been a theme in Jesus speaking to the, well, let's not get there in a second. I just want to add to that. We will often think that bad things happen because things aren't working the way we want. Or we think that bad things happen because maybe we're just, that church fell apart because of this or that other thing. Or because the devil was attacking. All that may be true. But in this case, Jesus was being attacked by the devil, but he was being successful. And it was the very purpose of being there. He was being successful. He was doing what he was called to do. And because he was doing what he was called to do, he was going to be handed over to men to die, right? That is exactly why. So we need to get this out of our head. I have this just like many people do, that when bad things happen, I'm always looking back to figure out what I did wrong. That may not actually be the case. It may actually be that I'm believing. It may actually be that I'm believing that this happens. So don't think of it that way. The Jews often thought of it that way. We often think of it that way. But we don't need to. God has a purpose. God has a plan, and he will stick to the plan. There has also been a theme, and Jesus is speaking to the disciples about hearing the words. Like God said, listen to him. He says here, listen to these words. That let the words sink in. Like that is a critical part of all the speaking to the disciples in this chapter that we've just been looking at. But they don't. Look at 45. But they did not understand this statement, and it was concealed from many. They just couldn't hear. They just could not hear it. Not anything of their own. This was not a failing of their own. It's just that they hadn't been given the ability to hear this. At the beginning of the chapter, they went out successfully not because of who they were, but because they were empowered by God. So the difference between the early part of the chapter and now is that somehow, for some reason, that power has been pulled back. It's not their fault. What they do is their fault. But the fact that they can't do it is not their fault. The power has been removed. And now they're not being allowed to hear clearly. But what they do is their thing. And what do? 46. An argument started among them as to which of them might be the greatest. Like, come on. Like, you just failed to do something that you were doing earlier, and you're going to bicker about who's better, who's greater? They were prevented from hearing, but they went on. This is on them. Jesus finishes saying he is going to be turned over to men, and without a beat, the disciples start talking about who will be the greatest. They just failed to heal the boy, and they turned to who was greatest. And Jesus cuts with his response. Knowing what they were thinking in their heart, he took a child and stood him by his side. Jesus puts a child in their midst and points who will be greatest. Something to remember about children here. A child becoming an adult was not a guaranteed thing in this time. Part of the reason children didn't have as much value in this culture was you didn't know if they were going to make it. You had lots of kids because a lot of them were going to die. Childhood diseases that killed them were common. Maybe not every, but it would be an unusual family to not have a child die. It would be an unusual family to not have a child die before they became an adult. So this is who Christ is putting in their midst. This kid who you don't even know if he's going to become an adult. That is who Jesus is putting in their midst. He's putting a child. Luke strips this story down. In the other ones, there's all sorts of talking about having the faith of a child and having the belief of a child and all that stuff. Luke doesn't say any of that stuff. That's not part of what he's saying. He says, whoever receives this child in my name receives me, and whoever receives me receives him who sent me. That's it. And then he finishes with, for the one who is the least among all of you, the one who might not even become an adult, this is the one who is great. There's nothing for them to do with this information, right? Except stop arguing. There's nothing for them to change their behavior with. Luke has stripped all that stuff out of this story. I think it's the same story. It's just Luke hasn't given that part of it to us. He has stripped it down because what he's after is what is important in your life that makes you an apostle versus a follower. And it's nothing to do with you. There's nothing for you to do except stop trying to be great, right? Just allow other things to happen. No one is talking about the faith of the child. Just the one who is least among all of you. This is the one who is great. So they get it? Next thing John said, John answered. Jesus said that, and John answers Jesus with this. Like, this isn't a separate thing. This is like John answers Jesus' response with, Master, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to prevent him because he wasn't doing it. He isn't following us. What? Okay, so what's going on here? We'll get to Jesus' response to that in a second. But look at ourselves, and we need to look at ourselves. The disciples are easy to pick on because they get propped up in this way. But look at ourselves. When we fail at something, when we see something and we're like, that didn't really go the way that I wanted it to, what do we turn to? Looking at other people around us, right? That's immediately what we do. We immediately start looking around us. Well, at least I'm not that bad, or at least that's immediately what we do. And we see that here from John. This is John, the beloved disciple, that's doing this, right? He is the beloved disciple. But this is what they do. When we come up against blockages, when we come up against things that stop us, what do we need to do? We need to not start looking around, right? We need to not start looking around. What do we need to do? Well, this whole story, all of chapter 9, has been about how these guys, who we have seen them do some blunders here and there, but at the beginning of this chapter, they were on. Well, let me rephrase that. They had been given the power to do what they were called to do. God had given it to them, and they had it, and when they acted out of it, it worked. Remember, Judas Iscariot is one of these 12. He was given the power, and apparently he did it. It doesn't say that 11 of them did it or 10 of them had good success. It says that they came back with success. It had to do with the power. And what do you need to do to allow power to be given to you? You need to assume you need it. That's what Luke and Jesus is saying here. If you come thinking you're great, what am I going to do for you? What am I going to do? You need to come to me thinking that you need me, and then you will be given the power you need. That's what he's saying. That's what this chapter is telling us. If we come thinking that we're God's gift, or we're a gift to God, then what's he going to do? If we come to him thinking that we need God, he'll do something. He will respond to that. And what is Jesus' actual response here? Jesus says to him, do not hinder him, for he who is not against you is for you. This is a little tricky, because we have other places where it says kind of the opposite thing. So what is actually being said here? This is a tricky saying. So what should we do when we run into a hard saying? Well, the first thing we should do is context. What is going on here? So that's what we've been doing. We've been looking at the context. We've been trying to figure out what's being said in this section that we're looking at. And what we see is that we have a series of stories where the disciples have wavered from the course. At the beginning, they had the power and were able to preach and heal. Then a series of times that they miss. The feeding, the transfiguration, where Peter says, hey, it's good, let's build some tents for you. The healing of the boy that they couldn't do. The argument about who was greatest. And here, trying to prevent people healing in Jesus' name. Right? We see this over and over and over again. These people, these 12, that Jesus has actually chosen to be the people to carry on after he's gone, are getting a taste of what it means to be without Jesus. Right? Literally, they're getting a taste of being without Jesus, and they can't do anything. And Jesus is reminding them this case. What do we hear in verse 49? Well, look at what we see. There are people healing in the name of Jesus who do not follow this particular crowd, right? These people are successfully casting out demons in the name of Jesus. The disciples are complaining when they are not able to cast out this previous demon, and here they're looking over there, oh, he's casting out a demon, what's the problem? Like, what's going on? This comes from comparing yourself, right? And Jesus is responding directly to this case. And he's saying, Jesus says earlier, had interactions with people, and he sent them out and had told them not to follow him, right? We have the paralytic who came down, and he said, get up and go to your home. And then we'll have many more of these, like lepers. We'll see many more of these as we go along. And then we have the demoniac in the Gerasenes who wanted to come with Jesus, and Jesus said, no, go back to your home and tell them about me. These people, this person that John is seeing, it could have been the demoniac. He could have been one of the people that Jesus had specifically told, you go over there and do that, right? This is someone who is being, I'm going to use the word successful, but with an asterisk, right? They're not being successful. They have the power of God in them, right? That is the difference. And so if you need to take Jesus' words in that context, right? Do not hinder him, for he who is not against you is for you. And who is not against you? The one who is not against you is the one who has the power of God in him, right? They may not be, I don't know what we are, but if you're a Presbyterian, they may not be Presbyterian. If you're a Pentecostal, they may not be Pentecostal. They may not follow all the letters. They may not have all the things like you do. But if they show the power of God in them and in their actions, they're for you. Take that to heart. Don't be pushed off by that. Be drawn in by that. Like, what's going on? Be drawn in. Be encouraged. Here is a person who has the power of God. I can have the power of God. This person is showing me that can be true, right? And so that's how we need to see the people around us. I think that we as churches are, how many churches are in our area? Well, there are a lot of churches in our area because we can't agree on these little things. But we should be able to see another Christian, see them living out the life of Christ, showing Christ to the world, and be encouraged by them. Not defensive, not scared, but encouraged by the fact that there is someone who is doing it too. There is someone who is part of the same body as me. Earlier we looked in Ephesians, and that church that we talked about in Ephesians, the one that's built on the apostles and the prophets and on the cornerstone of Jesus, that's not this congregation. This congregation can be part of that church, but that church is the whole. And that whole can be encouraging to one another. We join with each other to worship because we're friends and we're family and this is where we worship. But that isn't to the exclusion of others. We should see other Christians and be drawn to Jesus by looking at them, right? Anyway, all right, I'm going to stop there because I think I'm getting off onto a side tangent. One of the